Greetings, fellow Homo sapiens. Cole Hans here from the Symbiotic podcast. Today's episode is part 2 of a conversation we recorded this summer with two remarkable systems scientists, Riane Eisler and David Loye. Their decades of research into the mechanics of social evolution has a lot to offer the global community right now. If the meta-crisis we're collectively enduring in 2020 holds any promise for us to progress to a higher order rather than regressing to greater chaos and discord, we're going to need a truly holistic perspective on things, and that's what these folks have to offer. So without further ado, here's part 2 of our conversation with Riane Eisler and David Loye. David, you've dedicated a huge part of your life to this mission of helping society to recover the truth about Darwin, who is considered the father of evolutionary theory. And certainly Darwin still looms large as the person everybody thinks about when they think about evolution. But you have written about his vision of moral and cultural evolution, which is really, truly fascinating. So, as the host of this podcast about transdisciplinary science, in what ways did Darwin embody a transdisciplinary approach to science?
Well, Darwin was the greatest naturalist, but that before the chopping of science into little separate categories, both natural science and social science into all these little categories, he had the broad view of everything to put together. He had the most powerful multidisciplinary view of modern times. And what I discovered, I got a call to come to a secret meeting of scientists behind the Iron Curtain, back in Cold War days, go behind the Iron Curtain and meet our Russian counterparts. It was a secret get-together on what to do about the fact that the U.S. and Russia were getting ready to wipe us out, unless, as long as the driving interest of evolution was the idea of survival of the fittest, survival of the fittest. How do you get off the survival of the fittest kick? And we were actually among the co-founders of this little group that became a multidisciplinary group that extended out to Europe, into Asia, and so on, working on the idea of what kind of evolution theory do we need in our cook, as you would say, was that chaos theory was just coming in. It was the thing, you had some angle on chaos theory and so on. And Erwin Laszlo, who was a top system scientist then and now, laid out his proposal. He said in effect, what I want you all together is to launch the right update evolution theory. So we spent a decade, maybe it wasn't a full decade before, we put in a lot of work and did a lot of work together in Europe and many different places. And after a certain number of time at this, I realized that we weren't getting anywhere. We were just swapping references and swapping jokes and stuff like that. We weren't going anywhere. And I got to thinking, what did Darwin actually write? So I found myself as one of the few people empowered to read Darwin and understand his multidisciplinary viewpoint. We were into self-organizing processes and complexity theory and that whole thing. I had a computerized version of The Descent of Man. And so I thought, well, I'll just social scientific technique, word count. In other words, you simply analyze a document or something in terms of how many times they use the same word. I thought I'll run this on Darwin. So I thought, well, I'll put in what survival of the fittest. What does he say about survival of the fittest? Twice. He only writes twice referring to survival of the fittest. I thought that's peculiar because all this stuff, that's what we're sold as Darwin. Darwin is survival of the fittest, you know. And I thought, well, I'll try an alternative. I thought, well, what the hell? I'll try love. 95 times he was writing about love. And there was only a single entry in the index, that whole thing. And that index has been used now for over 100 years. In other words, you go now to any edition of most editions of Descent of Man, you'll find one little measly entry in the index for the word love. Yet he wrote,
and yet it shows up 95 times, and they only put it in the index once. And that's Descent of Man, which was the last work that Darwin wrote. Is that correct? He wrote that after Origin of Species, which is the one everybody cites all the time, correct?
My gosh, he seems to be referring to the moral sense all the time. But why haven't we ever even heard this? And I was doing another book at the time in which I was looking into the backgrounds of the top people of our time on the moral question. None of them ever even mentioned Darwin as a moral theorist. I discovered he was, as far as I'm concerned, the greatest moral theorist that ever lived, because he wrote 92 times about the moral sense, one version or another of the axiom, what helps us tell good from bad, and right from wrong, and so on. And this opened the whole thing to me, was that there was something else going on, and then I went on from there to identify all the ramifications.
Thank you for that. Yes. So that was the big aha moment for you. I want to ask you something, Riane. Where do you think our current society in the United States falls on your continuum between partnership and dominator systems? I mean, I know you say that it's possible to go forward and fall back, or go this way and go that way. No system or culture, I think you've said, is 100% dominator or 100% partnership, right? But where do you see the United States right now?
It's always a matter of degree, on a continuum. Basically, I think that we are struggling between a very powerful movement towards partnership, but not a coordinated movement, and a period of enormous regression towards the domination side. Because if you really look at modern history through the lens of the partnership domination social scale, you see that all the modern progressive movements have challenged one thing, the same thing: traditions of domination. I mean, think about it. The so-called Enlightenment, the so-called challenge to the divinely ordained right of kings to rule, right? And then came the feminist movement, challenging again the so-called divinely ordained right of men to rule over the women and children in the quote castles, a military phrase, of their homes. And also the so-called divinely ordained of a supposedly superior race to rule over supposedly inferior ones through the abolitionists, civil rights, Black Lives Matter, etc., anti-colonial movements, as well as the anti-war movement, and today the movements to change traditions of intimate violence. There's a global pandemic that is part of the tradition of child rearing in domination systems, of abuse and violence against women and children. These are all the way to the environmental movement, challenging our once hallowed conquest of nature, and of course the movements for economic justice against top-down rule, because what we're protesting is really domination economics. It isn't capitalism. I mean, whether it's a feudal lord or a Chinese emperor, there's a long tradition of that. They've all challenged that, but And this is what I really, if people take nothing else away, most of those movements have focused on dismantling the top of the domination pyramid, politics and economics as conventionally defined. Far, far less attention has gone, and still is not going enough, into dismantling the foundations on which the system keeps rebuilding itself. And I've identified 4 cornerstones. The first two are very obvious: childhood and gender. Then economics, getting away from this pointless argument between capitalism and socialism, both of which came out of the 1700s and 1800s, and we're now in the 21st century. But both came out of more rigid domination times, and changing our stories and our language. Because
our stories and our language.
Change our language. Well, look, linguistic psychologists tell us something that we had better pay attention to, which is that the categories provided by a language, a culture's language, channel our thinking. And that's very, very true of our conventional social categories, so that it's almost impossible, caught in those old categories, to even envision an alternative.
That's very powerful. I can relate to that. If no one has seen the lake and the trees, if all you've seen is concrete, how can you love the lake and the trees? You know what I mean? If that language isn't given to you, and the conceptions of something else, and you're in that rigid dominator family structure system, whatever you want to, whatever language you want to use, you have, in a sense, blinders on, and language can do that, right?
Well, and right and left, you can have domination regimes on both sides, and have had, religious and secular, same thing, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, capitalist, socialist. I mean, you've got to think about it. We need the new language, and the language I've introduced is the domination or dominator system and the partnership system. But I've also introduced words like hierarchies of domination versus hierarchies of actualization.
Yes, that fascinated me in your book, that you're not saying that we can't have any leadership, we can't have hierarchies, but when you talk about hierarchies of actualization, I think that's really beautiful language. It reminds me of some other work I've read on social justice and social evolution, and using power to empower others. Being a positive leader that uses one's own, even structural power in a system, to empower those that you're leading, so that they can be self-actualized as well.
But we haven't had words or phrases to make that distinction. I mean, a lot of people just reject hierarchy, but every society needs parents, teachers, managers, leaders. I mean, yes, children have to have certain limits, and they have to grow up considering other people, etc., rules. But there's a huge difference between authoritarian and violent parenting, modeling violence, and authoritative, nonviolent parenting, etc. And the fact that we read about, in the management literature, about the leader no longer being the covert controller, right? But the facilitator, eliciting from others their highest potentials. But we haven't had the conceptual frame. And if you're still in the old frame, it all is jumbled.
So we're looking for clarity, new language and clarity on that.
It's more than words. It's new ways of thinking, a new analysis.
Well, you mentioned four pillars. You mentioned childhood and gender and economics, and then the new language and the new ways of thinking.
New stories. Live by stories. Like, that takes us almost full circle to Darwin, doesn't it?
Yeah.
To the old story of Darwin that's been, so much written about, and the actual story of Darwin, who didn't have this language, but who was saying, hey, when you come to the human level, and we have to leave also behind this male-centered language of man.
Yeah.
Man does not include woman. Woman actually includes man. And so it's vice versa. But we want a partnership society. And so many men, by the way, have given my books to women in their lives, because I get a lot of mail from men saying, hey, there's a place for me here in the partnership system. So
Right
it's
on.
not about women against men or men against women.
No, I think that's a really important point, because I think a lot of men, there's this white male guilt thing too, of like, oh God, I'm the bad guy. I remember when I went to college and feeling like, oh, I'm a terrible white male. Like, I don't know how many people go through that, but you don't want to feel like the bad guy. You want to feel like an equal partner, to work together in partnership to transform things.
Precisely. And so we have a lot of work ahead of us, and I think that the meta crisis that you describe is actually an opportunity. We shouldn't go back to the old normal. In the United States, the old normal, almost 1/5 of children in this country live in poverty, many of them traumatized. I mean, what we're doing with really not only supporting mega corporations and billionaires, but we're supporting the destruction of our natural habitat, of the air we breathe. And I mean, it's a crazy system.
Yeah.
But we can't change it if we're stuck in the old categories. We have to see the partnership alternative. And that means also paying attention to this gendered system of values in which caring is not considered, quote, masculine. And I'll tell you something very interesting. What you see if you look at these Northern European nations, yes, women are 40% of the national legislature. So it's almost parity. They have the lowest gender gaps. But it's not only women who vote for caring policies, because as the status of women rises, men no longer consider it such a threat to their status, to their, quote, masculinity, to also embrace more caring, so-called soft or feminine policies. So if they have paid parental leave for both parents, if they have paid sick leave, if they have good parenting education, if they have elder care with dignity, if they have more environmentally caring policies, it's okay. It's not that, as in domination systems, if you, and women do this too, you're a wimp, you're a sissy, if you are like a woman. This is not about being a woman or a man, it's about being human.
Yeah. And saying that human beings essentially do care for one another after all. In our heart of hearts, we'd like to care for one. Like one of the studies in your book was like a little kid, like somebody drops something on the floor and the little kid will go pick it up and hand it to the person just naturally. Like, I want to help you because you are a fellow human being, and that's just innate in us. We lose that in a dominator system. It gets beaten out of us.
Well, nurturing our humanity really presents evidence based on solid studies, showing again and again a very different picture of, quote, human nature.
The Huck Institutes of the Life Sciences at Penn State offers 6 inter-college graduate degree programs in bioinformatics and genomics, ecology, integrative and biomedical physiology, molecular, cellular, and integrative biosciences, neuroscience, and plant biology. We also offer an accelerated professional science master's program in biotechnology. At the Huck, we immerse students in a groundbreaking environment built on interdisciplinary collaboration among some of the world's most innovative research scientists, and our students receive unparalleled access to bleeding-edge technology in world-class core facilities. If you're looking for a deeper, more holistic grad school experience, you owe it to yourself to look at the Huck. Visit us online today at huck.psu.edu. You mentioned Ervin Laszlo and chaos theory, and I know from reading your book that the group you were with were some really heavy hitter scientists with these emergent ideas from chaos theory and systems science. And can you speak a little bit to what you discovered in terms of Darwin foreseeing these things, foreseeing chaos theory coming in principles of self-organization? For our listeners, could you talk about self-organization, what that means, and what did Darwin actually have to say once you went back and looked at him?
In the 1980s, during the Cold War, and what was becoming really hot in science at all levels, it was chaos theory, it was complexity theory, it was basically the discovery of, or the rediscovery of the fact of self-organizing. Well, hell, after I identified things like the way he'd been affected for love and moral sense and so on, then I began to encounter these quotes out of Darwin like this, where he says, "The most important of all causes of organic change is one which is almost independent of altered and perhaps suddenly altered physical conditions, namely the mutual relation of organism to organism, the improvement of one organism, entailing the improvement or extermination of others." That was actually in the Origin of Species originally, where it could have, and then in the Descent of Man, he moves on. "There is a large class of variations which may be provisionally called spontaneous, for to our ignorance they appear to arise without any exciting causes. It can, however, be shown that such variations depend much more on the constitution of the organism than on the nature of the conditions to which it has been subjected." In other words, and there are many other supporting quotes there, where what he's saying over 100 years ahead of his time is this is where the action is. People self-organizing. And see, in our group, there were 4 of the leading chaos self-organizing theorists were in our group. They were there, so I was exposed to all this source of information on the self-organizing thing. And see, it was part of a huge shift that included in brain science. All of the science was based on the idea of it happens from outside, the climate changes or the people change or this and that. Everything that beats on you is required to move ahead. Well, one of my friends, the great, 2 of my friends, both dead now, Paul MacLean and Carl Prebin, 2 of the top brain surgeons, brain specialists of our time. They, in Carl Prebin's, he was instrumental in getting across the proof of the active brain. Up to that time, everything was, the brain was just a passive thing, and they're sitting there waiting for somebody to do something and make it change. But he was able to show that no, the brain is an active seeker. It's curious. It wants to know more. It's greedy. And that's part of what was so exciting then, and the excitement that I hope now lies ahead, that we're hopefully coming out, out of this meta crisis, that we were going to emerge and pick up where and complete Darwin's theory. The whole thing, that my whole mission that I felt at the time and still feel was to help complete Darwin's theory. I could go through all the works of good people, Garcia Narvaez, Irvin Laszlo, Ralph Abraham, etc., on and on and on. Ken Wilber, very powerfully. They were all working on aspects of Darwin's vision without realizing that was what they were doing.
I know that you helped to bridge those things, the more modern people who weren't even aware that they were sort of carrying on Darwin's tradition. You kind of discovered that by going back and try to reclaim and recover what we lost. And for our listeners and viewers, when you say complete Darwin's vision, I know what you're talking about because I've read your book, right? Or the last one from a couple of years ago, about that second part having to do with, as you said, the brain, and having to do with the brain being curious and wanting to go forward and not simply reacting. Like we're used to thinking about Darwin to say, oh, this animal, this fish gets longer fins because of these conditions, or a longer beak for a bird because of these conditions, et cetera, et cetera. We're used to thinking of Darwin that way. But he went on to write a whole lot more about human beings evolving through our brains, our mental faculties, correct? And that you're saying that's what's been completely lost, and it's sort of come back around in the 20th and 21st century. What would you tell people watching who want to be a part of evolving culture towards a more partnership-oriented system that is more caring? What do you think people as individuals can do to help move themselves and our broader culture in that more evolutionary partnership direction?
Well, you mentioned Einstein's quote that you can't solve problems with the same consciousness. He used the word consciousness, same thinking, but consciousness that created them. So it really does start with changing your consciousness. However, to change our consciousness, we have to really step back and sort of put aside so much of what we've been taught. I've often wondered, why do people who consider themselves progressive don't get what people who are pushing us back get? The importance of the primary relations. And I think part of the answer is that we've been more educated, and we've been taught that important knowledge and truth marginalizes or ignores anything to do with women and children. So let's keep that in mind about what we've been taught as, quote, educated people. And let's look at the whole picture. And it's a fascinating picture. People who read my books say that they're full of aha experiences, as was my research. Because all of a sudden, things that made absolutely no sense fell into place. So I think the first step is educate yourself in a different world view, which is what the partnership domination social scale, the biocultural partnership domination lens offers.
That's right. And it maps the personal and the political together. That integrative,
not the
bigger
biological
picture.
And the cultural together, because it isn't a question of genes, it's gene expression. I mean, science is full of showing that, but we ignore it, don't we?
That's
because
right, yeah.
we have not really been able to see that these old stories are there for a reason. They maintain us frozen and maintain a fragmented consciousness.
Yeah, new and integrative stories. Thank you.
Because consciousness leads to action, and changes and action then leads to new consciousness. because we see that there are other possibilities. But we can't just wait and wait and wait. It's time to understand that these movements towards a partnership, towards the partnership side of the scale, that they're not disconnected and random. It's not that the women's movement is over here and the racial movement is over here. If children grow up in families where they internalize a model of our species in which one human form, the male form, is considered superior to, is supposed to dominate the other, the female form, is supposed to be served by the other, they have a template for in-group versus out-group thinking. So it's not coincidental that whether it's racism in the United States or say in the Middle East, Shia versus Sunni or Sunni versus Shia, it's the in-group versus out-group, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's connected. You can't just say, well, that's just a women's issue or that's just a children's issue. Leave that kind of thinking behind. It is as really makes sense, doesn't it? And now neuroscience shows it. But the good news I want to say, as much as important as childhood is, we can change. And that's something else that's in nurturing our humanity. That studies show that even our synapses change once we begin to change our consciousness and once we behave differently. So we can do this. It's much harder. I mean, let's start with giving kids a real start, right?
Right. Yeah. Those values, I think a lot about, we put our value into, money is what we consider the value. That's how we display what we value or don't value. And you think about, I was a nursery school, I was a preschool teacher for a while. And I used to think the crappiest pay I ever had was taking care of little kids. And it just shows how little we value our children and raising children, the smallest children. And then like a football player is making millions and millions of dollars because we value somebody who fights against another guy and everybody watches it and gets excited and drinks and has a party. That's so valuable to us. Whereas me taking care of your kids for 40 hours while you're working, because you both have to work to make rent, and so you barely know me, and I'm taking care of your little kid like all week, is worth almost nothing, so.
Childcare workers in the United States, according to the U.S. Department of Labor, make less than dog walkers on average.
It boggles the mind. I mean, the value system right there.
I love dogs, but so what? Right. But look, the issue here really is what we've been taught to value. And what we've been taught and what is rewarded. What is rewarded? You put your finger on it.
Yeah.
So we can change that. We can that's why we developed the social wealth economic indicators. That's why we're working on a social wealth index. GDP is as ridiculous as it is, because, it measures as positives, making cigarettes, selling cigarettes, the resulting healthcare bills, the resulting funeral bills, they're all great for GDP. Did you know that?
Right. Yeah.
It's what? That's why we developed these metrics. And they're very different from other alternatives to GDP, by the way, because they do take into account this gendered system of values.
Well, it would be my hope that that this breakdown, to put it in Barbara Marx Hubbard's terms, because as I mentioned earlier, I took a couple classes with her. She talked about these evolutionary moments where a breakdown can be a breakthrough, and that our crisis can be a birth. And so having been through that's my lens that I walk around with. So when I've seen everything falling apart with the coronavirus, and then this uprising over the horrific murder of George Floyd, et cetera, I think, okay, this is it. This is the meta-crisis breakdown. And this is the opportunity for us to really evolve for people to come out in the streets and go, wait a minute, stop. Like you say, step back. Let's look at this. And what are we doing here? And where are we putting our money? They're talking right now as we have this conversation. There's the conversation in Congress. They all took a knee. The Democrats took a knee for 8 minutes, 46 seconds before they announced, they want to do a complete do-over on how we do policing in this country and all of these things. So this could be an evolutionary moment where we really, because they're talking about the money, they're talking about taking money out of policing and putting it into social services, just like Martin Luther King talked about.
More profitable investment, but it doesn't go along with the punitive policies that go with domination systems. Remember, why is there so much abuse and violence in domination systems? Because you have to maintain rankings, don't you? And they're ultimately backed up by fear or force. But people are socialized to do this. And until people who consider themselves progressive, and I'm talking now of both women and men, break free of the old ways of thinking, of the right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, it really is not going to succeed because we'll keep fighting each other without understanding that we just have to think of societies in terms of this partnership, the biocultural partnership domination lens. And once we do that, everything falls into place. And then we see that the interventions are there. If we're talking about economics, of course we wouldn't spend billions as we have on militarizing the police.
Right.
We would put that money so that children don't go to school hungry, so that people who care for little children get paid parental leave, but more than that, caregiver tax credits. Look, all economics are human inventions. Slavery.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Money's imaginary. It's all like they just printed up $2.2 trillion this year to bail everybody out of nothing. It's not based on anything but an agreement. We got to get way more creative with money, I think.
Well, we've got to be much more creative with our economy, because if we have an incomplete map where the economy only consists of the market, the government, and the legal economy, and it leaves out the three life-sustaining sectors of the household economy, the natural economy, and the volunteer community economy, you cannot build a new economic system. We're stuck with this overconsumption system, where 70% of the economic system in the United States is held together by people buying and buying and buying stuff they don't need, stuff that clutters up our environment.
And it breaks down in 2 years, and you need a new computer because it's built to break.
Completely. Money is made by banks and who give loans. This is nonsense. We can create money different ways. And once we have...
I'm with you there.
But I don't know every single detail because I'm a systems person. But I know that once we have this conceptual framework, our creativity comes out, our consciousness, and then we can create a completely different economic system. I have introduced partnerism as a new economic system, a caring economics based on partnership. We can do this.
That sounds beautiful. Yeah.
But we have to enlist not only people on the ground, but leaders. And that's
for sure.
very hard because it requires long-term as well as short-term thinking. But it can be done. It can be done. And that's why I'm still so very involved in teaching and in writing and in doing webinars and in speaking. Now, mostly online, of course. In fact, all online.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you're not the only one. Yeah, we've all been working from home. But I salute you. I'm so happy that you continue the work, both of you. Just continue putting it out there to the world and taking part in this grand human experiment of evolving and changing and growing and doing it with more and more consciousness and more partnership. And Riane, I got to ask you too, in your life, I asked David about his partnership with you. Can I ask you the same question about how your partnership with David has influenced you in your work and in your life?
It has influenced me enormously. I mean, David came into my life at a time, a time of breakdown, really. And he helped me make it a time of breakthrough. I gave up my law practice. I already had done that, actually, before I met David. And I started, my first book was was based mainly on my experiences as an attorney. It's called Dissolution, D-I-S, like divorce, Dissolution, and the subtitle was Marriage, something or other, and the Future of Women. No-fault divorce, marriage, and the future of women. And it predicted the feminization of poverty, actually, because of what happened with no-fault divorce. But that's neither here nor there. To get to your question, David is wonderful, has been wonderful. He's 95 now, and it's hard for him, hard for me. But we're so grateful to be together. And if I have to be in lockdown with somebody, that's my choice.
That's a beautiful statement. Thank you.
I want to invite you, Cole, to become part of our group, of the work being done by the center. We have a wonderful group now on the campaign for partnerism.
I'm all in. I'm absolutely all in. Yeah, I'm all in on that.
I will, because it's very hard. I mean, why am I teaching through this national foundation, Science Foundation, the Swiss National Science Foundation? Because academia is a hard nut. People get their perks for being indoctrinated in domination lore.
Yeah, I know. I know that.
What you're doing at Penn State is wonderful, and I'd love to get more people from various disciplines who you think might be interested in this new conceptual framework. I mean, Nurturing Our Humanity is such a great textbook.
Yeah, absolutely.
All kinds of courses. It is multidisciplinary. It's Oxford, so it has the imprimatur of, this must be kosher, right?
Yeah.
And it is new thinking.
Yeah, that's what we need right now.
So if we can get people from Penn State to start using it so that a new generation will have new tools, a new conceptual framework. Without it, we're lost. But I will ask Rosie and Nyla, who are really heading this campaign. But I'd like you to be sort of a liaison to the academic community. Would you be willing to?
I'm happy to do that. Things are still strange right now because we're trying to decide. We're going to find out from our president in about a week if they're going to reopen campus in the fall. All the students have been taking online courses. Everything's been online since they went away for spring break and never came back.
I think it should continue to be online.
Yeah. Second wave of infections. And, I work with infectious disease. We've made 50 videos about the coronavirus since the lockdown, literally, like just taking public questions. So I've been swimming in it. And yeah, I'm afraid about everybody coming back for sure.
Here, my daughter just wrote a letter to one of our supervisors, and I'm about to write another one in Salinas, which is where we have a very strong Latino and African American community. In the last day, there were 200 new cases. Why are they opening up?
Yeah, it's
insane. Madness. But it's because we have an economic system that's crazy.
Yeah, because the economy is more important than people's lives, right? And also, we could get into that whole talk about how the farmers had crops just dying in the fields and slaughtering animals, and they why not use the military to just get the food to people, because food's real and money's imaginary, and just like
I know
take care of people.
It should have been done.
Yeah,
it can still be done.
Yeah, there's a story about Einstein that says that if he had 1 hour to save the world, if the world was in peril of being destroyed, and he had 1 hour to, quote, save the world, he would spend 55 minutes framing the problem, and then the last 5 allowing the solution to naturally emerge from the frame that he had constructed. And why is it so important to set up the correct frame to take on any big, complex societal problem?
Well, that quote is so completely and absolutely applicable to why I have been working on a new conceptual framework for the past 30 plus years. Because it's like the blind man and the elephant, isn't it? What we've got going here with our analyses, social studies that leave out the majority of humanity, women and children, categories that do the same, and that focus. One focuses on economics, and another, capitalist, socialist. The other one focuses on religion. Is it or isn't it religious, etc. These are details that don't really matter. You can have repressive regimes that are religious or secular, that are capitalist or socialist. Look at the former Soviet Union, look at China. The reframing, it is the consciousness. That's what Einstein understood. And if we don't look, one of the principles of systems analysis is that you cannot understand a complex living system, and that's what human societies are, by just looking at one component at a time, which is what the academy does by and large, which is what the old social categories do by and large, right?
Yes.
You have to really look at the whole picture. You have to see how these components interconnect, how they mutually support each other, and why the 4 cornerstones. The 4 cornerstones as the primary foundational intervention points are based on research using the partnership, the biocultural partnership domination lens, instead of these old ways that maintain domination systems intact. They keep rebuilding themselves on these 4 foundations. I'll start with stories and language. The language fragments our consciousness, the social categories, the analysis. The stories maintain this notion that human nature is bad, right? Gotta be controlled from the top. And, that's the domination system. Economics has a gendered system of values running through it, which relates to the devaluation of the so-called soft or feminine, gender, women, and of course childhood. We know now, even from neuroscience, what really makes sense, that what children first experience and observe affects nothing less than how our brains, and with it our feelings, our habits, our actions, including how we vote, how we work, and what we think is possible or impossible, develop. So,
by putting our attention on those things and shifting away from the dominator models to a partnership model, everything can be transformed.
And this is long term. That doesn't mean that we don't have to also do short term, like the shifting of resources, for example, from a militarized police, which is crazy, to feeding children, educating children, caring for children, and breaking cycles of violent child rearing. of punitive child rearing. But consciousness, making available parenting education as part of our schools, not only to adults, to parents, but to the kids as they grow up. We teach everything. I wrote a book on education called Tomorrow's Children, which I would love people to use. But it's not just how we teach or the structure, it's what kind of stories we teach.
Yeah, I can completely relate. Yeah, I taught some middle school kids, and I had a gaming thing where I gave them a version of the future that was a paradise, and they were like, "That'll never ever happen." I was like, "How do you know? What do you mean it'll never happen? There could be peace on Earth." They couldn't even believe it. These are kids who are like, "That's just impossible." I said, 100 years ago, there was no such thing as the internet or planes flying and jets flying across. Does that happen now? Yes. Do you think people back then thought it was possible? No. Did it happen? Yes. Right. Yeah. I know what you mean about stories.
The truth is that scholars like Doug Fry, my co-author for Nurturing Our Humanity, have shown that in the last 100 years, it has been nonviolent change that has been the most lasting, not violent.
Yeah.
We're creeping towards it, but we don't have time. We have to change we're back to Einstein. Change our analysis.
Yeah.
Change our frame.
Riane writes so much about partnership societies and our cultural transformation theory, but it strikes me that the two of you are partners, and you've been for a good long time. And I wonder how has your partnership with Riane evolved you as an academic, a writer, and as a person?
It's my life. I was 52. She was 46 when we first met. We fell in love almost immediately. We both had previous marriages and so on, and children, all that. But it was not love on the first sight. It was probably love on a few seconds had to pass, and we've over 43 years now. We've been together. And it's been the most glorious experience I can imagine. I just wish it could go on for thousands of years. And as a matter of fact, I shouldn't even mention it, but I'm in a past life regression. I know that we were together in the past. I can prove it. You may not believe it, but I can prove it. And I know that we will be together again in the future, because with us, this very special thing happened. It's sort of the essence of partnership. Beyond words. I've written 2,200 love poems to her over the years, and they just barely begin to express the profound feeling I have for her, and that she has for me. I just can't get over it. There's this unbelievably wonderful woman, and she is in love with me. This thing is fantastic, and we live in this beautiful place.
Wow, thank you. I can feel that. Yeah, there's the power of love, compassion, and partnership. We need more of that in the world.